have to say, of all the challenges we've ever had at one of these lectures, having too few seats occurs very rarely. So I am so very excited and grateful to see all of you here this evening. My name is Michael Feltner. I have the privilege of serving as the interim dean of Seaver College in the current academic year. Before beginning this evening's program, in introducing our esteemed speaker, Dr. Sonja Lyubomirsky, I want to introduce two distinguished guests present this afternoon. First, I want to acknowledge the Dean Emeritus of Seaver College and the individual for whom this lecture series is named, former Dean David Baird. David, we're honored that you joined us tonight. Next, it's my sincere privilege to recognize Melanie Flaminio. Melanie and her husband, Richard, are the benefactors of the W. David Baird Distinguished Lecture Series. The Flaminios endowed this lecture series to honor Dean Baird for his service to Pepperdine and Malibu and to broaden the educational experience for all in our community. Melanie's a professional singer known throughout the music world as M.E. Page. And she also supports Pepperdine in many ways, and one of those is as a member of the Seaver College Board of Visitors. Melanie's joined here this evening by her daughter, Amber, and Amber holds a Master's of Arts in Psychology from Pepperdine University Graduate School of Education and Psychology. So Melanie and Amber, we're very grateful that you're here tonight. And if I may, could I ask that you please stand so we can express our appreciation? Thank you very much. Before we begin, a few words about our format for this evening. Following her introduction, Dr. Lyubomirsky will speak for approximately 45 minutes, and she is committed to concluding her lecture by 6 p.m., if not earlier. And the reason I say that is I have a suspicion that a few of our guests this evening may have a 6 o'clock class. So we would ask that you please wait until the conclusion of the lecture before dismissing for your 6 o'clock class. At the conclusion of the lecture, we'll have a very brief pause to allow you to depart, and then we'll follow with a question and answer period. I encourage everyone who does not have a commitment at 6 p.m. to please remain with us for the Q&A. Those are very lively and entertaining sessions, and I think you'll find it informative. Following the Q&A, Dr. Lyubomirsky will be available to sign copies of her books, and we have representatives from the bookstore present this evening, and they also have copies of the books for sale. To introduce our distinguished guest this evening is Dr. Steve Rouse. Steve is a renowned member of the Seaver College faculty, a professor of psychology, and he serves as the chairperson of the social science division. During his time at Pepperdine, Steve has been honored with a Frank R. Seaver Endowed Professorship, and he was the 2007 recipient of a Howard A. White Award for Teaching Excellence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Rouse.
Hi, good afternoon. To begin, let's play a quick round of repeat after me, okay? So I'm going to say some things. I'd like you to just say everything I say back to me, okay? Lou Gehrig was the first baseball player to have his uniform number retired.
Lou Gehrig was the first baseball player to have his uniform number retired.
Good. Okay, Lou.
Lou.
Good. Okay, tie your shoelace in a bow.
Tie your shoelace in a bow.
Good. Bow. Great.
Simba's
friend Timon was a meerkat.
Simba's friend Timon was a meerkat.
Mere?
Mere.
Great. Okay. It is better to ski than to snowboard.
It is better to ski than to snowboard.
Ski.
Ski.
Lou?
Lou.
Bow?
Bow.
Mere?
Mere.
Ski?
Ski.
Lyubomirsky.
Lyubomirsky.
Excellent, excellent. Great job. In the past few years, a lot of my students have been reading the research of tonight's lecturer, Dr. Sonja Lyubomirsky. You see, in one of my classes, Personality Psychology, my students are required to write a term paper not about a topic in personality, but instead about the research conducted by a contemporary personality researcher. I give my students a list of some of the most prolific and influential modern personality researchers and teach them how to conduct a search of the articles written by one particular person. Then I encourage them to simply pick a few names at random and read the titles and abstracts of their work and find someone whose research captures their interest. Well, in the past few years, a lot of my students have opted to write about Dr. Lyubomirsky's research. But can you blame them? I mean, imagine that you come across a person who's written articles with titles like, "Recalling positive events at work make employees feel happier, move more, but interact less." Then another one, I like this one. "In defense of parenthood, children are associated with more joy than misery." And then another one, "Is it possible to become happier, and if so, how?" Who wouldn't want to know more about topics like this? Well, in welcoming Dr. Lyubomirsky to the podium, I could talk more in depth about the 55 peer-reviewed journal articles that she's published, each one exemplifying a methodologically strong research. Or I could talk about her 13 chapters in scholarly edited books, or her New York Times best-selling popular books, or I could even play for you the rap that was written to summarize her research. But instead, I'd like to end my comment by reading to you a comment that was written to me by one of my students who wrote a term paper about Dr. Lyubomirsky's research this past semester. The student wrote, "Her research has affected me in a positive way I never expected. After studying her research, I am more mindful, grateful, kind, curious, and accepting." What better way to commence this year's Dean's Lecture Series than to hear from a researcher who can make a term paper a life-changing experience? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sonja Lyubomirsky.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here, to be invited, to be part of this very eminent lecture series. Okay, I just want to make sure that I start my PowerPoint. By the way, I'm sure you know you have one of the most beautiful campuses in the entire world. It's really great to be here. I live in Santa Monica, so not too far away. Always happy to come here. So I'm going to be talking about my research on happiness, and as you can see, I also provide a little mnemonic here, which you don't need, about how to pronounce my name. My name means love and peace in Russian. I come from Russia. So I think it's kind of appropriate for someone who studies happiness. So I'm going to be talking about my research on happiness. These are my wonderful collaborators. And I'll be referring to a couple of my books today, The How of Happiness and The Myths of Happiness. So during the Second World War, aviation experts spent a lot of energy and resources studying military planes that went down. And one day somebody asked, why don't we study the planes that stay up in the air? And I think that's a really apt metaphor for the research that I and my colleagues do. We study why happy people are happy, why healthy people are healthy, why successful people are successful. By the way, there are 2 seats right there, anyone who wants seats, and a couple others that I see towards the front. So we'll be talking about happiness. How many people here wouldn't mind being happier than you currently are? Okay, wow. Okay, and how many of you have friends, family, colleagues, parents who you would like to be happier? Okay, pretty much everyone. So I can't promise that I'm going to make you all happier, but I will arm you with a lot of information based on research. I believe that all of us want to be happier. We might define that word happiness differently. We might pursue it differently. But I would argue that almost everything we do in our lives, in a sense, is aimed at becoming happier, sort of doing things that give us meaning and happiness. So researchers have actually asked the question of how important happiness is by going around the world and asking people, how important is happiness to you? I'm going to give you a sample of just a few countries, US, Greece, Germany, South Africa, China, and Argentina. I was just giving talks in both Argentina and Germany about happiness, and so I put those up for them. So on a scale of 1 to 7, how important is happiness to you? Americans rated about a 6.6, so pretty high. That's not surprising. Some people think that Americans are kind of preoccupied with happiness, maybe even obsessed with happiness. It's embedded in our Declaration of Independence. But what about other countries around the world? What do they think? So here's the data. For other countries, also, very high importance placed on happiness. I should mention that there are some significant differences in this graph. So People in Germany and China actually rate the importance of happiness as lower than other countries, around a 6. But still, it's quite high. So I would argue that happiness is perhaps even a universal goal. Even in the country where I'm from Russia, I came here when I was 10 years old. People talk about the importance of suffering, right? So you have to suffer to build character, to gain salvation into the next life. And of course, there's other cultures and religious traditions that kind of focus on suffering. But even in Russia, when you ask people, what do you want most for your children? They'll say, I want my children to be happy. So I think it sort of depends on how you ask the question. So, many people, if not most people, want to be happy. So is happiness a good thing? Some people think that happy people are selfish. They're kind of focused on themselves, right? It's all kind of about me, me, me. They're not very focused on others. That happiness is really about pleasure. So my colleagues and I tried to address this question. We did what's called a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies. We looked at 225 studies that were done on happiness. And what we found were that happy people were more successful, actually, in health, in relationships, and in work. So, for example, we found that happier people are more productive at work and more creative. Lots of studies show that if you measure happiness at work, the happiest people today will be more productive, say in 3 years. Happy people make more money and they have better jobs. So, of course, the causal direction goes both ways. Having money makes you happier, but also happy people are better at accruing more money. Happier people are better leaders and negotiators. Happier people have better relationships. They're more likely to marry, less likely to divorce. In one of my favorite studies, researchers looked at college yearbooks. They looked at the yearbooks from Mills College, which is a women's college in Northern California. And they found that, and they coded the pictures in those yearbooks. So, okay, from now on, you're going to all take a look at your high school or college yearbook photos to see if these women show genuine happiness in their college yearbook photos, okay? And there's something that it's called a Duchenne smile. You can't fake it. Very few people, unless you're a really good actor, can fake a Duchenne, sort of an authentic smile. Women who showed genuine happiness in their college yearbook photos at age 21 were more likely to be married by age 27 and had more satisfying marriages at age 52. It's kind of amazing. So there's something that carried through. Happier people have more social support. They say they have more friends. Happier people are also healthier. I'm going to talk about that in a second. They even live longer. And, contrary to this perception that happy people are more kind of ego-centered or selfish, happy people are actually more other-centered. They're more charitable. They give bigger tips. If you know individuals who are depressed, or if you yourself have been depressed, you know that depression makes people kind of focus inward. And that's, people say that that's adaptive, right? When you're sad or depressed, you need to focus on yourself to understand your problems. And so you can argue that when you're happy, you actually kind of have the luxury of focusing on others, right? You're not sort of so focused on your own problems. So happier people are more philanthropic, and happier people are also more resilient. They cope better with stress and trauma. Okay, so let me talk for a bit about, I already talked a little bit about marriage, about health. Okay, so why do you think, maybe I'll throw this out, why do you think happier people are healthier? What's a reason? Don't be shy. Exercise. So they maybe exercise more. Maybe they have better health habits. Any other ideas? What? Better diet.
Because they're exercising,
They're getting the endorphins. So I think someone said less stress. Less stress. Okay, so lots of different reasons. Well, researchers have explored these different reasons, and it's true that happier people do have better health habits. One thing they're interested in is in the immune system. Do happier people, or having positive emotions frequently, is that associated with having a stronger immune system or immune function? So for example, let's say, you all have flown on airplanes. Some people, every time they fly, they get sick, right? There are sort of rhinoviruses, cold viruses in the airplane. Some people never get sick, or sometimes you get sick, sometimes you don't. Maybe it has something to do with the strength of your immune system. So in one study, which I call the cold virus study, there's a picture of the cold virus, lovely, isn't it? Called the rhinovirus. In this study, researchers found healthy volunteers. They had them complete a measure of happiness, and then they injected the cold virus into their noses, okay? It's maybe not a study everyone would want to be in, but they were paid handsomely to be in the study, $800. $800. But it wasn't just the cold virus. After these healthy volunteers of all ages got the cold virus, they quarantined them. They put them in a motel for 5 days. I mean, they could do whatever they wanted, but they needed to stay there, and then monitor them for a month to see the relationship between happiness and who developed symptoms of a cold. So they all were exposed to the cold virus, but who actually got sick? So they measured like cough and mucus and all that, and they found that happier volunteers were less likely to develop symptoms of a cold and actually recovered faster. And other studies have shown same kind of thing. A recent study showed that happier people who received the hepatitis B vaccination showed a stronger immunoprotective response to the vaccination. By the way, this was found when researchers controlled for things like body mass index and age and ethnicity. So it wasn't and depression too. So it wasn't the case that happier people were just less likely to be depressed or thinner or younger. Okay, so that didn't explain the finding. Okay, so this is just one example. I don't have a lot of time today kind of going through all these studies, but there are about 200 or more studies showing that happier people are better off in terms of health, career, and relationships. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that happiness is something that most people want and that it's a good thing, that it's associated with all kinds of good stuff and success. But a lot of us have the wrong idea about what will make us happy. So my most recent book is called The Myths of Happiness. So I want to mention a little bit today. And it's really about kind of this idea that, a lot of us have that, well, I'm not happy, and see if this describes you, okay, or people you know. Well, I'm not happy now, but I will be happy when, okay, and then you name a bunch of things. Like when I'm married, then I'll be happy. When I have a boyfriend, when I have a baby, when I get that job I really want, when I strike it rich, when I make money, that's when I'll be happy. When I move to that city where I always wanted to live in. And then people also talk about, so these are kind of reasons that we feel that we'll only be happy. People also have ideas about what kinds of things will make them kind of unhappy forever. What will make them terribly unhappy? Being single, not finding a life partner, getting divorced, getting old, especially getting old with unfulfilled dreams, having a health condition. And so I talk about sort of how these myths play out in our everyday lives, and I kind of try to debunk them. So let me kind of show you some data, because I'm a research scientist. So first I want to talk about divorce. So a lot of people feel that, divorce is a terrible, very difficult life event. But a lot of people will say, well, I can't get a divorce. It'll be just so horrible. I won't recover from it. It'll make me terribly unhappy kind of forever. And so here's data from a study of about 10,000 people, 8,000 people. They were followed every year for about 10, 15 years. So every year they're asked, how happy are you? And some of them got divorced in the middle of the study. Some of them got a new job, some of them lost a job, so they were kind of looking at people's happiness before and after major life events. So this is the data on divorce. So this is happiness. Year 0 is the year of the event, in this case, divorce. And whenever you see an asterisk or a triangle, that means that people's sort of baseline happiness has either dipped significantly below their happiness has dipped significantly below their baseline or has risen significantly above. So you see year zero, and I'm kind of hiding part of the data. Year 0 is the year of the divorce. You see how 2 years before the divorce, people's happiness is already lower than it used to be. Does that make sense? Maybe that's kind of things aren't going well in the relationship. Then they get divorced. So what happens the 5 years after divorce? Okay, look at that. Okay, so Year 4 or 5 after the divorce, people are way happier than they ever were in the relationship. Now, we don't have data kind of going even farther, maybe 10 years back, 15 years back. And actually, I have a friend who's going through just a terrible divorce right now. Terrible, terrible. And I sent her this graph. And she told me that she looks at the graph every day. Every day. Now, of course, it's an average. It doesn't mean that it's going to happen exactly that way for you. It's an average over many, many people. So this shows how resilient people are. And here's data for being laid off. So these are people who are laid off from their jobs. You see the year before the layoff, people are already less happy than they were. So maybe there's an indication in their workplace that there are going to be layoffs coming. Maybe it's not, the company's not doing so well. And then it takes about 4 years for people to recover from that. Here's widowhood. Widowhood is a much more kind of severe event. People become very unhappy. A year before, the spouse is probably having health problems. And then there's a rise in happiness. It takes 5 years to kind of get back and get over the baseline. So that's widowhood. So the take-home point is that people are remarkably resilient, that almost nothing is as misery-inducing as we think it will be. So we think like, oh, I'll be terribly unhappy if I get divorced, or even if I become widowed, or I don't make as much money as I thought I would if I get diagnosed with a medical condition. Studies show that people who are facing adversities actually report kind of a silver lining. In one of my favorite studies, women who have breast cancer reported that 2/3 of women with breast cancer reported that the cancer led to positive changes in their lives. They said that it led them to kind of appreciate the preciousness of life. It was a sort of a wake-up call. They realized what their real priorities are. Maybe it's family versus work, or maybe it's that they really wanted to be a teacher or an artist. They realized who their true friends are. And then they realize that they have strengths that maybe they didn't even know they had, maybe kind of a maturity or a courage or humility or sort of just the ability to get through the day. And lots of studies on this show the same kind of thing, that people who are overcoming adversities sort of realize that they have strengths that they didn't even know they have. Not to say that we should all kind of experience adverse events just so we can grow, but this is, by the way, it's called post-traumatic growth. Okay, so these are, so that's why I sort of call all of these myths. Now, I'm not saying that we should all get divorced or, not have kids. We all are going to get old, so we don't have a choice about that. But I think it's important to kind of look at the research, because sometimes kind of a misunderstanding of what truly makes you happy or unhappy can lead you to make some poor decisions. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Okay, so now this kind of resilience that people have also has what I would call a dark side. So human beings have the ability to get used to almost everything in their lives, whether it's illness or divorce or sort of downsizing, having less money than we want. But it turns out that we're also really good at getting used to the positive things as well. So I'm sure you've all discovered this. You get a new gadget or a new car, or you move to a nicer home, a nicer apartment. At first, you're really thrilled about it, and then you get used to it, right? And then you want even more. This is called hedonic adaptation. So one example I like to use is a number of years ago, I had LASIK. Anyone here has had LASIK? And I used to hate glasses and contact lenses, and I was almost blind. I couldn't, see very well at all. And, this 2-minute procedure, and I had 20/20 vision. And you know how long it took me to adapt to that vision and sort of take it for granted? 2 weeks. 2 weeks after a lifetime of sort of near blindness. So, human beings are just very good at getting used to good things. We get used to being a college student, being called a dad, being called a doctor. And so if we get used to sort of almost everything positive, then how can we sort of ever become happier? That's something that I'll talk about. So let me talk about marriage, right? Weddings. So, getting married, I think, was one of the best things that have ever happened to me. But people adapt to even things like marriage. Okay, so here's the same data from the same study. By the way, all of these data are for females, but the data from males are almost identical. I just didn't want to show too much. Okay, so year 0 is the year of the wedding. You see -1, a year before, people are already happier than their baseline. Does that make sense? Yeah, they're in a great relationship, maybe they're engaged. So what do you think happens after you get married? How long do you think the boost in happiness lasts? All right, shout it out. 2 what? 2 years? That's very pessimistic. 6 months. All right, I'm kidding though. Any other guesses? 7 years? You hear about the 7-year itch, right? That must come from some research. Okay, the answer is 2 years. 2 years. After 2 years, you're back to the baseline. Now, of course, there's a lot of variation. Some people get happier and they stay happier. Those are the people I'm really interested in, talking to them, like what is it that they're doing differently. Some people actually get unhappy after they get married, so this is an average. So kind of, again, the take-home points is from this research on myths is that there's no magic formula for happiness, and there's no sure course toward misery. And then we have to understand that life's turning points do not have to become major crises. So so like when you get married, when you get divorced, maybe you make more money, you lose money. They're not necessarily kind of times where you're suddenly going to become a lot happier or a lot less happy forever. And being less excited with your marriage or with your new house or with your new gadget is not a cause of concern. Sometimes people, and we all know people who like constantly change jobs, right? They're in a new job, they're excited, then they're kind of bored. Oh, let me get another job. And then they keep moving. And same thing for relationships, right? Or cars. I read somewhere, I think it was like the average American owns a car for something like 2 years, something ridiculous like that. And people, of course, like to lease cars because they can get new ones. So we just get bored and we're like, oh, I want something new and different. So that kind of belief and thinking, there must be something wrong with me because I'm not, as excited with my relationship or my job as I used to be. People have to understand that that's part of human nature. Now, sometimes your relationship or your job or your house really does need changing, but often that's not the case. We're just undergoing this very natural process of hedonic. So remember that, hedonic adaptation. Remember that and recognize it when you see it happening to yourself. Now, how do we kind of keep that excitement alive? How do we not adapt to our new marriage or a new job or a new car? Well, it's hard to do, but there are, and I talk about in my book about sort of how to use variety and novelty and surprise and appreciation to try to not adapt. So appreciation is pretty obvious. You move into a new home and you really or you get a new car and you try to appreciate that home or car, to really think about, not take it for granted. That takes effort. Variety, novelty, surprise. If we open ourselves up to challenges, opportunities, growth experiences, meeting new people, we're less likely to adapt, right? So a relationship where you kind of do the same thing every Friday, Saturday night, you're going to adapt to it. But a relationship that kind of keeps you growing, maybe together you take up new hobbies, you meet new people, that can prevent you from adapting. So those are sort of some of the strategies people can use. Okay. Now what about children? So you heard I have this article called In Defense of Parenthood. Okay, this is what happens, by the way. This is a picture of I have 4 kids, but although I started doing this research when I had 2, picture of one of mine 5 minutes after birth. So what happens after the birth of a child? So you see -1 year, -1, already people are happier. Now, they're not pregnant yet, right? Because these are actually both true for both men and women. But, maybe you're in a new maybe you're married and you're, anticipating having a child. And then the happiness kind of drops and then recovers. Now, what is happening? I kind of like to ask this. What is happening at year 2, 3 that you think is making happiness drop for most people? What? Exhaustion? I know, but why not year 1? Right? Isn't a newborn or child is running? Number 2. Oh, terrible twos. Terrible twos. No, well, I don't think that's what it is. I think it's number 2, right? So people are having another child when they're 2, when the first one is 2 or 3, and I think that really puts them over the edge. Now, my students and I have been doing research on sort of parenting and happiness, and we find that the question of like, are parents happier than people who don't have kids is actually not the right question to ask, because there's all kinds of parents and there are all kinds of non-parents. So what we have found, we have a paper on this, is that parents are happier than they're child-free, and I've learned to say not childless, but child-free, right? Childless is politically incorrect. Parents are happier than non-parents if they're middle-aged or old. Okay, so if you're those of you contemplating parenthood in college students who are parents are much less happy than their peers who don't have kids. Now, of course, people who are older also have older kids, so that has an influence. So if you have kids who are either in middle childhood or grown, you tend to be happier than people your age who don't have kids. The data on marital satisfaction shows that the happiest time in a marriage is when the kids are gone, when they have flown the nest. Okay. That's called the empty nest. So those of you, the students here, you have improved your parents' marriages. If you've actually, of course, left the house. I don't know if everyone here has left the house. The second happiest time is during the honeymoon period of the marriage, right? So that's before kids. The least happy time, when do you think it is? Teenagers. Yeah, that's exactly right. The least happy time is teenagers. The second least is when you have at least one child under 5. So I have 2 teenagers, 13 and 15, and 2 children under 5. But we're doing okay. We're doing good, yeah. Okay, so if you're married also, as opposed to a single parent, you tend to be happier. If you're a father, sorry to say, fathers are a lot happier than men without children. Mothers with children are about the same in happiness as mothers without children. If your children live with you, if they're biological or adopted, having stepkids is not associated with more happiness. And if your children are relatively trouble-free, which seems kind of a obvious point, but research shows that overall, all parents report, no matter whether you're married or how old you are, having more meaning than people who don't have kids. So there's a difference between happiness and meaning. Okay, so to continue, I've sort of shown you some research about like the benefits of happiness and kind of misconceptions we have about happiness. So when we have kids, when we get married, or when we are diagnosed with an illness, sort of how can we become happier? How can we sustain that happiness? That's kind of the question that's been driving a lot of my work. Is it possible to become happier? And if it's possible to become happier, can we actually sustain that? Because we all know how to become happier for 5 minutes, right? So there's a lot of self-help literature. I don't know if any of you actually go to real bookstores or only virtual bookstores. No matter which kind of bookstore, you'll see lots of titles with happiness in them. Here's just examples of some bestsellers. Happiness is free, and it's easier than you think. And that's interesting. That's actually kind of the opposite of what I'm going to argue today, which is that happiness is harder to attain than you think. But you can't really sell books, right, that are called like, happiness is really hard to attain. You could be happy no matter what, happy for no reason. So again, there's kind of a theme in a lot of the titles. And again, maybe it's just the publishers driving this, that's like, happiness is easy and free. I get called by media all the time. Pretty much every day I get an email from reporters. And sometimes the women's magazines are kind of the worst, because they'll ask me, give me 5-minute happiness strategies. It's always like 5-minute happiness strategies. And I tell them I can't do that. You can't become happier in 5 minutes. And my favorite book is You Can Be the Wife of a Happy Husband. Actually, if you look at the date, this book is not my favorite book, actually. So it argues that women should be submissive to their husbands, kind of do what their husbands want, and then you can have a happy husband. So I'm not actually recommending that book. Okay, so there are three reasons that researchers actually have been pessimistic about whether you can even become happier, okay? One reason is, and this is another one of my kids who is really happy, is that we're all born with a genetically determined set point for happiness. So lots of research in the field of behavior genetics that shows that identical twins who share 100% of their DNA are much more similar in their happiness than our fraternal twins. Are any twins here? Okay, not as many as I expected, but so fraternal twins are not as similar in their happiness. So that suggests that there's a genetic component to happiness, that there is some truth to the idea that kind of you're either born, you either have it or you don't. It's not the full truth, but there is some truth to that. So if happiness is partly genetic, does that mean we can't change it? Can we not become happier? So that's it's a reason for pessimism. Those of you here who have children or siblings, you know that some are just happier than others. And that's true, definitely true for my kids. Happiness is part of our personality. It's a lifelong trait. And those of you who've taken personality psychology know that that personality is pretty stable across the life term. You can change personality. It used to be thought that you can't change someone's personality after age 30, and that's actually not true. There's actually an article that was literally called, "You Can Change Someone's Personality After Age 30." But there's really high rank order stability in personality. Okay, so think about your high school class. The kids who are the most extroverted in your high school class are probably 10, 20, 30 years later, probably still kind of in that upper, quartile of extroversion, and that the same thing goes for happiness. So if happiness is a lifelong trait, it's part of our personality, then how can we really change it? And then there's hedonic adaptation, which we've already talked about. So if we adapt to almost every good thing that ever happens to us, then how can we become happier? So those are the reasons to be pessimistic. Now, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't think that there is actually reason or cause for optimism. So my argument, kind of in a nutshell, is that despite the finding that our happiness is partly genetically influenced, and despite the finding that our life situations, like getting married or having kids or getting a new job, have a surprisingly small influence on our happiness because we tend to adapt, I argue still a very large portion of happiness is under our control. And my book, The How of Happiness, says that that's 40%. Now that number is an estimate, so don't take it too seriously. I actually now have a warning on my slide saying these numbers are approximate because people just think they're set in stone. So when you ask the question, what determines happiness? About 50% of individual differences in happiness. So when you take everyone in this room and you ask the question, why are some people here happier than others? About 50% of the answer is because of genetics. That's a pretty large percentage. About 10% of the answer is because of life circumstances. Now, this is assuming that you're kind of relatively comfortable and you're not in like a horrible relationship, you're not poor. 10% is lower than most people expect. And so that leaves about 40%, probably less, I don't know what the exact number is, but a large portion of happiness that's under our control through the ways that we behave and the ways that we think. So there are things we can do to become happier. It takes work, it takes effort. So that's really what a lot of my research is about. Now, what is it that we can do to become happier? So this is the part that's like really unsurprising. If you, read magazines, if you read books, newspapers, you watch TV, you probably have heard about like what kinds of things people can do to become happier. So happy people tend to express gratitude. They're more forgiving. They're more likely to have significant life goals, something to look forward to. They're more likely to be spiritual or religious. They meditate, they engage in exercise. All of these strategies have been associated with greater happiness, and many of them have been tested in experimental research to sort of show that they can actually make people happier. So there are probably 100 strategies out there. So what I do in my research, I actually test them systematically. So just because someone tells you, oh, you should count your blessings and you'll be happier, that doesn't mean that that's gonna be effective. Okay, so what I do are called happiness interventions. And an intervention is kind of like a clinical trial. So clinical trials might test a new drug, and there'll be a control group. And clinical trials also might test, like, what's the right dosage of the drug? Or Are there people who maybe shouldn't take this drug? Or maybe if you have a certain condition, you shouldn't combine sort of 2 or more drugs. So in a sense, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm focusing on happiness strategies instead of drug treatments or other kinds of treatments. Okay, so these are some examples of happiness interventions that we've conducted in my laboratory with my grad students. And if there's anyone here who's interested in getting a PhD in psychology or positive psychology, email me. We have some room for new grad students over the course of the next few years. So what we do is, again, happiness interventions where we ask people over the course of several weeks or months on a regular basis to try to be more grateful, to try to be more kind to others, to savor their positive experiences. And of course, we follow them across time and we measure their happiness, usually just by asking them, how happy are you? And we also always have a control group, some kind of neutral group that we can compare the experimental group to. So I'm just going to give you a flavor of some of the research that I've done, and these are also things that you could try yourself. And my research articles, which are on my website, which you can easily get to by just Googling my name, and my books also sort of describe these. Okay, so we did a study where we asked people to count their blessings for 6 weeks. So I'm not a big fan, actually, of counting blessings. I always thought it was kind of hokey, but a lot of people tell me that it works for them. They really makes them happier. So I did a study to test it. So we had people write down, these were students. Actually, these were college students in this study. We have studies with all kinds of populations. This one was with college students. We asked them either once a week, every Sunday night, write down 5 things that you're grateful for, or 3 times a week, every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday night, write down what you're grateful for. Pretty simple, right? So here we're interested in whether this works, and also in the importance of dosage, right? So like 3 times versus once, what's more effective? So here's what we found. So these are histograms. They show changes in gratitude on the left, and changes in happiness from before to after the 6-week intervention. Now, the control group is the green bar. For some reason, the control group actually got less happy over time. We can talk about that later if you're interested. Okay, but the important finding, the red bar is once a week. You're counting your blessings every Sunday night. The orange is 3 times a week. People who counted their blessings 3 times a week did not become more grateful. They did not become happier. Those who did it once a week, on average, got happier, got more grateful. Now, why is that? We have some ideas. We think maybe it kind of became a chore for people to do it 3 times a week. Sometimes these activities lose their freshness and meaning when you do them too often. Although some people tell me, I count my blessings every day, and that works for them, and that's great. So it's also important to find what fits your personality. I'll talk about that in a minute. This is a great study that had students evaluate their college professors. And in one condition, they asked them first, write down 12 things that you like about your professor. And another condition, I think they had them write down 3 things that you liked about your professor. And then they had them rate the professor. Which group do you think liked their professor overall more? The one that wrote down 3 things. So sometimes writing down too much, maybe you can't think of 10 things. And then you conclude I must not like this person. And maybe the same thing happened with our gratitude manipulation, right? It's like you can't think of things to be grateful for, so it can backfire. We're still working on this. Okay, so I want to talk about the importance of fit, because a lot of people do come to me and say, I hate counting my blessings. I have a colleague who would never, ever do such a thing, but he discovered that writing emails, sort of gratitude kind of emails, to important people in his life, like mentors, teachers, coaches, parents, was very meaningful to him. So I got interested in the importance of fit, that you have to kind of choose what practice and what strategy fits your personality, kind of fits your goals, fits your strengths, and fits maybe the source of your unhappiness, whatever it is that's making you unhappy. There's an iPhone application based on my research. It's actually now not being supported too well. It costs 99 cents. It's called Live Happy. I don't make any money off of it. I use it for research, so I'm going to show you some data from it. We're now working on Live Happy 2.0. So those of you who got too adapted to your gadgets and have gotten now the new iPhone 6 or whatever, then you'll need to wait for Live Happy 2.0. So in this particular iPhone app, we have 8 different strategies that people can use using their phones. And so, for example, gratitude journal on the upper left-hand corner, you can write emails or texts or call someone on your contacts list and thank them for something. One of my favorites is the Savoring album on the lower left-hand corner, where you can pull up a photo from your photo album and write about, or take a photo of someone you love or a place you find beautiful and write about it, kind of savor it. So the idea is that you use your phone to engage in these different happiness strategies, because we thought, well, people have their phones all the time, so it'd be easy to do this. But we also are collecting data, so we asked people how happy they are before and after, sort of throughout their experience, and we asked them about fit. How much are you enjoying doing this? How natural does it feel for you to do this? And this is what we found. These are the 8 activities, and this is sort of the average fit for our users. Interestingly, the gratitude journal was pretty low in fit on average, but actually it doesn't really matter what the fit is because it's going to differ for different people. What matters is I don't know if you can see this, the higher the fit with a particular activity, the more likely users tried that activity and the more likely that they benefited from it by actually becoming happier. So maybe that's kind of obvious. Okay, so I want to tell you about another study fairly quickly that we did where we asked people to try to become more optimistic. And the intervention we use is we asked people, and actually this study also was done with students. I've tried to pick up some studies with students. We asked students, imagine yourself in 10 years. We think 10 years is kind of a good amount of time. And imagine your dreams coming true. So like in 10 years, you have your ideal job or your ideal partner, whatever. And every week for 8 weeks, they wrote about this in different domains in life, sort of career, health, romantic life, family life, okay? So those are the instructions. Kind of think about your future, write about everything going well. So it's essentially an optimism exercise. And then we also had a gratitude condition where we had students write, and people were randomly assigned to one of these groups, write gratitude letters. So every week you choose a person in your life who's maybe really helped you, had an impact on you, and you write them a gratitude letter. You actually could write to the same person across a couple or 2-3 weeks, or you can choose a new person every week. And these are actual sample essays that students wrote. Here's one that a student wrote. This is the optimism condition, and this is about their family life. And they wrote, I guess that if things were ideal, I would have moved where my family is, and I would have a relationship with my family again. Having my sisters and their husbands over for supper and game night, possibly adopting a child or two. So, they sort of write about kind of their life that they imagine in 10 years. This is a letter that a student wrote in the gratitude condition. Dear, I just took the name out. I just wanted to write you a quick note to let you know how grateful I am. I know I don't tell you this often. I appreciate all the times at work when you would bring me in lunch or special treats. You always made me feel welcome. So anyway, this is an example of a gratitude letter. So we had people write gratitude letters. We also had people try to be optimistic. We also had a control group. And in this study, we're particularly interested in the importance of motivation. If you want to become happier, you got to be motivated and put the effort into it. And so we had half of our students sort of self-selected into the study because they were really motivated to become happier, and half didn't really care. Okay, so this is happiness, change in happiness from before to after the study on the left. The green bar is the students who were sort of not really that motivated about happiness. The red bar, people were motivated. And 6 months after the study was over, which actually for us is a kind of a long time, you've long forgotten being in that experiment. So the red bars, the motivated subjects are still happier whether they practice gratitude or optimism. So motivation is really important. Okay, and what about social support? I'm a runner, and so I have a buddy that I run with. So when I wake up in the morning, I don't want to get out of bed, but I know that she's going to be waiting for me at our sort of predetermined spot, and she'd be really upset if I wasn't there. And I probably play the same role for her. And so we were looking at the importance of kind of having support, your family, friends, maybe a buddy to kind of practice these activities with. And so this study, we asked people to think of their best possible selves, their dreams coming true in the future. And so the red bar shows that people who practiced optimism got happier relative to the control group. But then the green bar shows that if you had social support, you got even happier. So again, maybe this is kind of an obvious finding, but it's important to show that social support matters. Another question that we're interested in is whether our happiness interventions might help people who are depressed. And so, sort of the question kind of is if you're depressed, would you benefit even more from these kinds of interventions, from trying to express gratitude or optimism or do kind acts? Maybe because of floor effect, if you're kind of over here, you have more room to improve and you're more motivated to improve. Or maybe if you're depressed, you're going to benefit less because if you can't get out of the house, you're not going to go out and do acts of kindness for people. We actually did one study with college students, and we found that asking depressed college students to write gratitude letters actually made them a little less happy. And we were surprised. We actually stopped the study, and it turned out that they felt like a failure. They were like, I don't have anything to be grateful for. So it just was too difficult a task. And what we're finding is when people are depressed, you have to kind of start with a very small kind of intervention. Like, think about a good thing in your life. The word grateful can actually be hard to wrap your mind around when you're depressed. And I give a lot of talks to mental health professionals, and they'll tell me the same thing, that their clients will say, I can't do this. Now, this is one of my favorite findings I'm going to show today. We're also interested in the importance of culture. And so before I show this, let me explain kind of what we did. So we have a collaboration in South Korea. And so we had South Korean college students and American college students do acts of kindness on a regular basis for 6 weeks, or write gratitude letters. And so this is the data for Americans, the American students, and we found that this is change in happiness from before to after the 6 weeks. So 0 is kind of before the study, 1 is 3 weeks into it, and 2 is right after the study's over. And you see I think that's teal, the teal line, students who wrote letters of gratitude got happier over time. You see that? Got happier over time. Students who did acts of kindness on a regular basis, that's the red line, got happier over time. These are American students. These are at UC Riverside, where I teach. And this is what we found for the Korean students. It's really interesting. So the Korean students who did acts of kindness got a little happier, and the Korean students who wrote gratitude letters actually got less happy. And so we've been very interested in this finding. We've talked to a lot of people from Korea and our collaborators who say that, gratitude is kind of a mixed emotional experience in Korea, that there's sort of this expectation of reciprocation when you express gratitude. And sometimes it can even be insulting, like you're not supposed to thank your parents. It's almost insulting, like, well, of course I did this for you. I'm your parent. So we just finished a study in France, at different companies in France, and we found that writing gratitude letters for these French participants, it made them feel happier and more uplifted and more inspired, but it also made them feel indebted and embarrassed and guilty. So gratitude could have kind of this mixed emotional experience. So sometimes it might even backfire. So that's something that we're interested in studying as well. Okay, so very quickly, what's next? We're looking at how positive activities work. Does age matter? We've done studies with teenagers and with kids. We were actually really worried that teenagers would not want to write gratitude letters. Some of you are teenagers, and actually they loved it. They said they recognized that they weren't grateful enough. We just finished a study with teenagers in the UK, 16-year-olds, and we're looking at, these were twins, so we're looking at kind of possible genetic influences on who benefits from a happiness activity and who doesn't. We don't have the full data yet. In terms of age, I also want to add that it turns out that older people are happier than younger people. And by older, I mean like 40s, 50s, 60s into 70s. And it turns out that they're emotionally wiser. It's kind of like older people know what makes them happy, and that's what they do. They know certain people make them happy, and that's who they spend time with. And that's an interesting finding in itself. We're also interested in measuring behavior. So we've done studies where we have people wear these badges, and the badges have an accelerometer in them, just like your gadgets might. So it measures physical activity, and they also send and receive infrared signals. So if you're all wearing badges, I can see who's talking to who, like who interacts more. So we did this study, this is one of the titles that you heard about today from Professor Rouse. So we did a study in a Japanese company where we asked them to write down 3 things that went well at work. And you can translate this to school also. You can also all try to do this. 3 things that went well at work or school. That was the experimental group. And the control group wrote about 3 tasks that they accomplished. people who wrote down 3 things that went well at work got happier, more connected with others, and they moved more. It looks like they had more energy at work, and they left work early, which we think is a good thing because at this Japanese company, most people worked until like 11 or 12 at night. So anyway, so that's kind of interesting. So I would sort of leave that for you, that kind of practice every week, thinking about what went well at school or work. And I'm going to end with a quote from Aristotle, who 2,000 years ago kind of basically described the gist of my research, which is that happiness depends upon ourselves. Thank you.
If you have a question for our speaker, please raise your hand. We'll give you the microphone, and we'll begin.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the depression. Strange. You mentioned that, at least the example you gave when speaking of people who were depressed, that the experiment didn't really work for them. Are there experiments that do?
Yes, so there's not a lot, so that there more research that needs to be done. So Marty Seligman, who's at Penn, did a study with severely depressed people where we asked them every day to write down 3 good things. So that's kind of where my suggestion comes from, that to make it like very simple. And they had a pretty incredible response to that. So I just think using the word gratitude makes it, just makes it harder for depressed people to, again, to kind of wrap their minds around it. So I don't really know of a lot of studies with depressed people, like with doing other kinds of positive activities. So it's just, there's more that needs to be done. But again, I think starting kind of simple. I do a lot of studies where I haven't really discussed them, but where I ask people to do acts of kindness. And so, yeah, if you're like really depressed, you're not going to go out and meet people and do nice things for them. But maybe you might do acts of kindness that are from using your computer or some simpler way. So you just have to kind of tailor the strategy to the individual. Thank you. Yes. So right here. Oh. Well, why don't you go first, since you have the mic, and then you'll be next. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
I was just really struck by the fact that you can get used to positive things in your life.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if there were any studies done that measured like the long-term effect of like the acts of gratitude or doing random acts of kindness, because based off the your ability to adapt, then it would seem like those things would wear off too.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, right? So we get used to like new gadgets and new life circumstances, but we also can get used to new activities, right? So new practices, although the adaptation is slower, right? And part because there is more kind of variety and novelty. So if you're going around doing acts of kindness, you might meet new people, right? There's sort of some surprises. So you're not going to adapt as fast. And actually, I find that depending on the study, like 6, 9, 12 months is when people tend to adapt. And so what we do is we tell people to try to kind of vary what they do. Maybe like in the iPhone app where we have 8 different strategies, so you don't do the same thing. You might switch to another activity or practice. But absolutely, people do adapt to activities.
Here you go.
Oh.
Could you pass this down, please?
When you were talking about the parenting and you said the difference with happiness and meaningfulness, I was wondering if you could talk about the measurements for meaningfulness, because there would be empathy or spiritual development in that. So I was just curious.
And it's just such a short talk, I didn't go into kind of even definitions of happiness and meaning. So happiness is defined as having 2 components: the sense that your life is good, that you're satisfied with your life, that you're progressing towards your life goals, but also positive emotions, right? Experiencing curiosity, pride, affection, joy, etc. And so you kind of need both of those for happiness. Now, meaning I'm not a meaning researcher. I'm not sure if I can give a good definition of meaning, but in terms of measurement, we've used measures that are just kind of ask people, like, how much meaning do you have in your life? Like, I feel like my life has meaning, or I think my life is meaningless, reverse coded. So these are self-report measures. So yeah, I think empathy and spirituality would play a role in that, but it's not part of the measure. I think it's a correlate. So people who are, for example, more religious and spiritual report more meaning. And so like the studies with parents, Some studies measure both, usually either happiness or meaning, and then they find, that pretty much in most studies, on average, people who have kids report more meaning, but they don't necessarily always report more happiness.
The reason I ask, because the Aston research out of UCLA shows that empathy is one of the 5 distinguishing features when you have spiritual development. So that's why I was asking more about empathy, especially relating to parenting.
Yeah, of course. That's such an interesting question. I just don't know any research on empathy and parenting. I guess that's a great, maybe there is in another field, but not in my field. So that's a great opening for future researchers. Thank you. Yeah, hi.
I was wondering if you found a correlation between friendship and happiness, and like if someone had a friendship with their family, would that make them more happy, or how many friends they had?
So, and I haven't done this research myself, but yeah, there's a very strong correlation between happiness and friendship, both the number of friends and the quality of friendships and the quality of support. I don't know of any studies that actually experimentally test this, like the activity would be, okay, try to make a new friend or try to enhance your friendships. And that would be the great study to do. I would be shocked if it didn't work, In fact, I have a chapter in my first book, The How of Happiness, on relationships and how people who nurture relationships are happier. Thanks. There's someone behind.
I have a question. During health crises, have you seen any research, or have you done any research on how to maintain your happiness or your level of contentment during a health crisis?
Right. So I myself don't do research in this area, but there really is a pretty big literature on this. People study individuals facing all kinds of, medical crises or chronic conditions or pain. And so, and I actually have a chapter in The How of Happiness about some of this and about coping and kind of what coping strategies are good. Like, again, this is going to sound kind of simplistic, but, looking on the bright side, trying to grow from the experience, not dwelling on the negative. And this is called post-traumatic growth. How can you kind of grow from traumas? Not that everyone does. But again, I'm not an expert in it, but I could suggest either maybe start with that chapter because it has some references that you can look at, and you could always email me if you want sort of more references. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much. I really look forward to reading both of your books.
Thank you.
Second, as someone who has close friends who has family with a history of substance abuse, I was wondering if you have studied graphs like you have with cancer and widowhood, et cetera, that show a growth in happiness after people give up alcohol or smoking or drugs, and what happens after that point at 0.
Yeah, wow. I don't know any research on that. That would be so interesting to look at. I do have a colleague, actually, who studies alcoholism, and he studies former alcoholics, so people who used to be alcoholic and they are no longer, I guess they consider themselves lifelong alcoholic, but they don't use. And he studies redemption and how people talk about that experience in using the words, sort of the language of redemption, like it was a redemptive experience and they're kind of better off now and they're more mature and more complex and happier now. So that's something to look at. His name is Will Dunlop, Dunlop. But that's more of a narrative kind of perspective. I don't know any research on the kind that you're asking. Wow, lots of questions. Yeah.
Should I wait? Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, I wanted to make sure you were looking this way.
Sorry.
I know there are multiple mics.
Yeah.
So I have a question about sort of the communal conditions, right? So I, for example, scanned on Netflix and I've seen a film that describes a place where there's a higher proportion of people that are happy, right, in comparison to other locations. So I'm thinking about an institutional context like this. What are some of the conditions that might actually foster happiness from a communal perspective, not just an individualistic perspective?
Right.
While that's valuable and important, I'm also interested in how to extend this to sort of structural space.
Sure.
Yeah.
A very good and difficult question to answer. So actually, the city of Santa Monica right now is engaged in kind of a well-being initiative. In fact, I just took their survey where they're measuring the residents' happiness and well-being and trying to understand kind of what they can do to improve the city in ways that kind of foster the residents' well-being. So that's a really hard question. And I'm not an expert in it. I know at the level of like nations, what has been associated most with happiness are equal rights, democracy, democratic institutions, and GDP, so like wealth, money, although it's all correlational, right? So nations that are wealthier also happen to be more likely to have like things like equal rights and democracy. And what makes people really unhappy is economic uncertainty, political uncertainty, like war, not surprisingly, and graft and corruption. So that's kind of, obvious kind of general answers in terms of like more community level, social capital, whatever can like foster relationships, better family and neighborhood relationships, I think would increase happiness. So again, it's not really my area. It's almost like you want to talk to a sociologist, but that's a start. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, once again, thank you for coming and talking. I was just curious if you knew of any research that studied the relationship between happiness and music or music preference.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I don't know any about music preference, and maybe there's no relationship, but certainly, it's funny, a lot of experiments induce happiness using music. So we all know listening to sort of upbeat music can make us happy, listening to sad music can make us sad. So researchers actually often use music as a manipulation to induce certain kinds of emotions. So that's, I guess, the only way I know how to answer that question, but I don't know any research on just, music preference. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So it seems like in our society, extroverts are oftentimes like exalted for being happier, having more fun, or having more friends. So in your research, have you noticed any difference, introverts and extroverts?
Right. So it's funny. this question came up recently. I was part of this, there's this course, I think it's edX, at Berkeley, that, you can do one of those MOOC, the MOOCs, on the science of happiness going on right now. And I was doing a web chat with the students. It's a free course for anyone around the world. And that was like a question that came up repeatedly. People kept saying, because there is a correlation between extroversion and happiness. Extroverts are more likely to be happy. And people kept saying, well, but, I'm an introvert and I'm really happy, and why can't introverts be happy? And some of you may be familiar with Susan Cain's book and TED Talk on introverts called Quiet. So like a third of people in the world are introverts. And all I can say is that it is a correlation. And what I think I don't have the data, but I think what happens is that if you look at extroverts, more of them are happy. So like, let's just pull it out of a hat. Out of 100 extroverts, maybe 80 are happier and 20 are less happy. Out of introverts, maybe it's more like a 50-50, which means there's plenty of happy introverts, but just this is my guess, not having the data in front of me, but just the association is a little less strong. So that's kind of my answer. But of course, it's just, extroverts are also more likely to have kind of more friends. You don't have to have a lot of friends to be happy. You can have just one or two like really solid, close relationships. Really good question. Yes.
Hi. Do happy people tend to surround themselves with happy people and vice versa? And then a follow-up question, if you have a community of happy people and you introduce people who are less happy, do they rise to the level or does the level come down?
Gosh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that second question. That would be a great experiment to do. Not sure how you do that. You could even do it like just in a group, like a class, or like a team at a work setting. So there is research on emotional contagion, and it shows that emotions are contagious. So, when you're around happier people, it does affect your happiness. If you're around sadder people, it makes you a little more sad. There's research that was done, a famous study was done in colleges showing that this happens like in dorms. If you're assigned to a roommate who's depressive, for example, you become a little bit more sad yourself. That makes sense, right? You kind of are talking about depressing things. So I know about that work specifically. So there is emotional contagion. Okay, yes?
Hi. In your research, have you found any correlation between happiness and managing one's expectations?
Right. So really, you're getting at kind of the heart of sort of what to do with hedonic adaptation, right? That what happens when you adapt is that your expectations change. So let's say you buy a new house in a new neighborhood and it's a bigger house than you used to have, one thing that happens is you start kind of changing your expectations. You start comparing yourself with your neighbors who might have even bigger houses, and so suddenly your expectations rise. Now you want, a deck, or you want something even more, so your expectations keep rising. And in fact, one really intriguing study that I read not too long ago showed that like Denmark is often a country that is shown to have the highest happiness. It doesn't really matter, like it's not significantly higher than other countries, but it tends to be on top. And one study showed that the Danes had lower expectations, and maybe that's why they're happier. So I don't know of any work that actually actually gets people to change their expectations. I think that's really hard to do. And I would not advise people, I actually have a section in the Myths of Happiness about this. And I say I don't advise people to lower their expectations necessarily, but I think there are different kinds of expectations. When you're about to give a talk, I think it's good to have high expectations and aspirations. Like, I expect to do well, and it can create a self-fulfilling prophecy, right, if you have high expectations. But I think just in terms of, like, once you're in a new job, or you buy a house, or in a relationship, that you don't want to have your expectations constantly escalating, because then you're never going to be satisfied. So, like my husband used to cook dinner like half the time. Now he cooks dinner all the time, every night. And now I kind of expect him to cook dinner every night. So I take it for granted, right? So anyway, very complex question. Thank you. We keep switching sides, right? So, okay.
I just wanted to ask, number one, thank you for coming. And number two, based on your studies of people who have been depressed and their happiness levels, what interventions could we do as a community to sort of help them? Because obviously the happiness interventions have not been very effective.
Right. Well, first I just want to say that, I did mention the gratitude letter intervention that was not effective, but simpler ones have been shown to be effective, right? So one idea, again, just to, if you have, say, depressed friends, to encourage them to do something very simple, like every day write down one good thing that happened today. Okay, just kind of start small. Maybe then later you can go to 2 good things. Or do a nice deed, and it could be something very, very simple. Every day do like one, because the thing about doing acts of kindness is that it takes the focus off of you and puts it onto someone else. So you don't want to do too much, because that could actually be a burden, but if you do little things, it could make you happier. And in terms of, what I also respond, and again, I have a chapter on this in my first book, is that many depressed individuals need professional treatment. So I'm not saying that, you should forego treatment and just write down 3 good things every day and you'll be better. Sometimes some people need drugs, and they need professional, mental health care. So that's the first thing I would say, is like, if you know people who are depressed, encourage them to seek professional help. But then maybe at the same time, or maybe after the treatment has ended, they can do kind of little things, like doing little acts of kindness, or, and there's 100 strategies they can use. Those are just some examples. Thanks. Okay.
Hi, this might be kind of similar to the question that you just answered about expectations, but I'm really curious about the idea of whether the pursuit of happiness in itself makes happiness more elusive. So I'm wondering if you have seen a discrepancy in results between research participants that might pursue happiness directly and those who might pursue it indirectly.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there's actually a new line of research that basically shows what you are suggesting. So if you pursue happiness kind of too directly, too deliberately, and you monitor it all the time, am I happy yet? Am I happy yet? Kind of like people who, if you're trying to lose weight, you don't want to weigh yourself 3 times a day, then it can backfire, right? So if you're too kind of obsessed with it. And so, and it's somewhat obvious, right? Just like with any goal, you don't want to kind of be too obsessed with it. And you don't want to monitor your kind of success too often. So kind of like you suggest, what I suggest is that people should try to pursue happiness indirectly. So you kind of focus on I'm going to try to be more grateful, or I'm going to try to be more kind to other people, or nurture my relationships, or pursue new goals, with sort of happiness as kind of a great byproduct. Yeah.
Okay. Going back to the introvert-extrovert kind of paradigm, introverts are kind of introverted because they find extrovertive tendencies to be uncomfortable. So if extroverts are considered and have been found to be more happy, would it be conducive for an introvert to attempt to do extrovertive things and be uncomfortable, or would it be, in the long end, pay off?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like you almost answered your question yourself, because I think my intuition is no, right? That it's gonna, if you're an introvert, it's gonna make you uncomfortable, and it's not gonna make you happier to kind of become an extrovert. There are some exceptions, and I will kind of, to get personal here, I used to be kind of introverted and sort of pathologically shy when I was little. My parents tell me that I basically did not speak to adults outside the family until age like 11. And I just got out of it. Like I just, with a kind of force of will and effort, I decided to become an extrovert. But I think that's pretty rare. I've met other people who tell me they've done the same thing. But I think it's, pretty rare. Most people, that's their personality, and and I talk about the importance of fit, right? If being like around a lot of people all the time, if that just doesn't fit your personality, that's not going to be good. So there's so many other ways to become happier that I don't think there's a need for introverts to turn into extroverts.
This will be our last question.
Maybe that. Thank you. These have been amazing questions. Really, really great questions. And you've been anticipating like whole fields of research that either exist or don't exist. Yeah. Okay, last question.
Hi there.
Hi.
First of all, thank you very much for coming. It's been a privilege listening to you.
Thank you.
So I'm really interested, and I don't know, I keep on seeing things online about the effects of social media on happiness, and just how people, there's like active use of social media and passive use, and people kind of, it all seems to be kind of conjecture to me, but I was curious as to what kind of research and studies you had seen as to the effects of social media on happiness.
Thank you. It's such a great question, and it is really confusing because there's so many mixed results. So I don't really have a bottom line. I can tell you about some of the findings. So if you have an unusual interest or condition like illness, or maybe you're a parent of a disabled child, like finding those communities online with social media has been amazing for people like that. If you're shy, so I have a daughter clearly inherited from me who's very shy. I think for shy kids, being on social media actually can be great. On the other hand, there's some like recent research that showed that, for example, people feel more depressed after going on Facebook, because the idea is that like people kind of boast and they always talk about all the positive things that are happening to them. We don't post like pictures of ourselves yelling at our kids, right? I kind of dare anyone to do that. But anyway, so yeah, there's like these mixed effects, and then on the other hand, more kind of well-adjusted, extroverted people are actually on social media, but that's probably just a correlation, that if you have a lot of friends off of the media, you're more likely to use it. So there's just such mixed findings, and I don't really have an answer, because I think it sort of depends how you use it. And using anything too much, everything is in moderation, right? Did Aristotle also talk about the golden mean? So everything in moderation, including technology. So thank you. That's a great way to end. Yeah.